Okay, aloha and welcome back to the afternoon sessions. My name is Elena Huffine and I'm the moderator for this session titled Approved SWPPs Do Not Illustrate How to Prevent Sediment Discharges or Erosion. Please use the Q&A feature during the presentation to ask any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a few minutes for the speaker to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session. Dr. Jerald Fifield started Hydrodynamics Incorporated in 1982, and he has been actively involved with drainage, sediment and erosion control, water rights, and non-point pollution control. Through his company, he develops sediment and erosion control plans, completes drainage analysis, provides inspection services, and teaches about controlling sediment and erosion on construction sites. Dr. Fifield founded the Worldwide Certified Inspector of Sediment and Erosion Control, or CISEC, program that educates and certifies qualified construction site inspectors of sediment and erosion control. In addition, Jerry has authored numerous professional papers, researched sediment and erosion control products, and written sediment and erosion control manuals for designers and reviewers, along with field manuals for inspectors and contractors. Please help me in welcoming Jerald Fifield. Good afternoon, Jerry.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to the session. I'm hoping what I present today doesn't discourage a lot of people from some of the quality papers that we've seen so far, but the title says it all for what I've found over the last 20, 30 years that I've been involved in here, namely stormwater pollution prevention plans. They don't really illustrate how to prevent the discharges of sediment and erosion. And so what you're going to be seeing is sort of an accumulation of what I've observed and have collected over the years throughout all of the United States. And I'm going to start off with some examples of rules and regulations that I have found that bring in the word preventing. And I want you to concentrate on that word preventing. And when you take a look at some of these things that are being in front of you right now, there's a lot of things in there that you need to be a little bit leery of. And I'm going to highlight them all. First one up there, do not allow sediment to leave the site by preventing erosion. Sounds great. Sediment shall be removed. Escape of sediment will be prevented. Got to retain all the eroded pollutants and so forth on down the line. Well, when you start looking at these, you got to ask yourself on this first one or second one down, does this mean all sediments are going to be removed or just maybe a couple of them? And take a look at another one. How can this be accomplished? How are you going to retain everything on site? So I started taking a look at this and I started seeing the word prevent, preventing, prevent, and so forth on down the line. And I asked myself, well, we always say we're going to prevent things, but what is the definition of prevent? And this is pretty important. When you see the word prevent, that means you're going to keep it from happening, or you're going to stop something from happening. That's the definition of prevent. So if we go back to our session here and say, do not allow sediment to leave the site by preventing erosion, how are you going to do that? How are you going to stop erosion? And how are you going to stop sediment from leaving a site? These are something that are next to impossible to achieve, and we might as well admit it. And every SWPP that you're implementing are probably giving you something that's impossible to achieve. But we can do a lot of this by minimizing, and that's what I'm going to be emphasizing as I go along on here. But as I look at this, regulatory agencies, can any of those meet the criteria that's presented? So that's a big problem. Designers, Do you know BMPs that will prevent the escape of sediment? Contractors, be careful what you sign because these are what you have to live by. Inspectors, if you have to live by these rules, you're going to be writing up a lot of notice of violations because of these criteria. They're not practical is what I'm getting up to here. But let's ask ourselves, how do you stop erosion? Only way I know is by installing impervious BMPs. I guess you could do it this way. I mean, every construction site obviously has a concrete pad going through it before you start doing construction activities, right? And of course, the plastic on the hillside, hey, that's impervious, does a terrific job of doing nothing. And why haven't I said something about the vegetation? Well, this may be a shock to a lot of people, but vegetation does not stop 100% of the erosion that occurs underneath the canopy cover. The only ones that do it are impervious conditions. And our real world conditions that we got to live with, boy, they're something else. I mean, we are making a mess. We have to make a mess on construction. There's no other way of doing it. We got a lot of bare ground. And when it rains, we are going to discharge a tremendous amount of sediment. And that tremendous amount of sediment is really difficult to control. And more importantly, it's impossible to prevent. So with that in mind, let me ask a question to everybody to think about here. Is the problem the amount of sediment leaving the site, or is it the amount of runoff that leaves the site? On this graduated cylinder, what's your idea of mind of saying how much sediment's in that water? Well, if you let it sit for 96 hours, you're going to find that the sediment is down there. The heavier stuff is down there. Your water's not clear by any means. And if you look on volume wise, it might be 5 to 10% of the volume of water. In reality, it's probably closer to 1 to 5% of the volume of water. Our problem is how do we take care of the runoff, not the sediment? So those are things that we got to concentrate on here. So the rules, the regulations, the specifications that exist for the state of Hawaii, they got to reflect local construction site conditions. So with that in mind, there's obligations for 4 main players in this game: reviewers, designers representing the permittee, contractors, and inspectors. I'm going to try to hit all of these if I can today, but I'm going to concentrate on the ones that you commonly see on a construction site. And notice I use the word sediment and/or erosion control limitations, and you'll see me use the word sediment always at first, because the first items that are installed are sediment control measures, because they are the ones that we have to live with to try to minimize the sediment from leaving the site. We want to do as much erosion control as possible, but you can't do it with a lot of heavy equipment going all over the place. So let's just take a look at those 6 items that we have in there. But first, before we go through, what's your definition of erosion? Hopefully you say something a little bit like this: soil particles displaced by the action of wind or water being the predominant one for you in Hawaii. But what's sediment? That's the eroded material suspended in there. Sedimentation is the process that results in the deposition of those suspended particles. Keep those 3 in mind. You cannot lose track of them. Doesn't matter if you're a designer, a reviewer, a contractor, or an inspector. They are critical. So, do the detail sheets that you have in Hawaii, do they really represent what happens on your local climate conditions? And the reason I bring that up is that the islands of Hawaii, they have literally 2 different climatic regimes that I've seen. On the east and north sides of the islands, you got tropical and humid climate conditions. On the west and south side, you got almost arid and semi-arid conditions. I was amazed when I found out that Honolulu has an average precipitation of about 17 inches of rainfall. Colorado has 14 inches of precipitation. Of course, we have snow on there. So you're really more in the arid and semi-arid climates. And vegetation that grows on the east and north sides is going to be probably a lot different than what looks on the west and south side. So keep those in mind. So as we go through here, ask yourself the detail sheets that you have to live with. Did you obtain them from some other sources? I mean, did you get them from Colorado? Did you get them from New York? Did you get them from California? Do they truly represent the conditions of the islands? That's the thing that needs to be done. And have they been updated to reflect whether or not we're on a east side or on the west side of the islands? Very important that that happen because the conditions are totally different. You'll see that. Let's start with a typical VMP detail sheet that sometimes you see on a construction site. Simplified in this case, but it has a lot of goodies in there that I want you to concentrate on. And the first thing I want you to do is go down to the lower right-hand side and see it says erosion control details. Wow, erosion control details. Looking at that sheet, there's the only erosion control detail on that entire sheet. All the others are predominantly for sediment control. So we have a detail sheet. We have to have them be the correct notation on there. So make sure, designers, that you are using the right wording. Make sure, reviewers, that you're reviewing the right detail sheets. But then these are just one of many things in here. Let's just take a look at one of the details and see what are some of the things that happen. And by the way, these are things that happen all over the United States. It's not to Hawaii specifically at all. But I look at the very first one. Take a look at that title. Silt fence, erosion barrier. And all I can put on it is, Silt fence is a sediment control mechanism. It's not an erosion control detail. So get everything correct on there. Then to go up to your notes, erosion control measures shall be maintained. What? Sediment control measure will be maintained until landscaping is complete. Remember, landscaping is an erosion control technique. So we got some things that are just really confusing. So designers, take a look at that. Contractors, take a look at these details you're living with. Make sure they're accurate. And one of the big ones is right up here at the very top. And if I was a contractor, I would be thrilled to death to know that I can put the post on a silt fence 15 feet apart. Boy, that saves me a lot of money. But does it save you a lot of money? Somebody's going to have to get in there and repair that, isn't it? Well, what if you didn't have to have that to begin with? Well, I guess you could put in wire backing behind every silt fence. That's expensive. Metal T-posts, wire backing. And if you go back east, you can use a chain link fence. These are actual specifications that are required for different parts of the country. So do they cost money? Yep, they sure do. But just to give you a little bit of a feel for things about what happens in failures, have any of you ever gone out when it's been raining in Hawaii and just take a look at your VMPs in place? I happened to be one in Colorado where I was out on doing an inspection, and a rainfall event came on a construction site. And they had silt fences in the drainage channels, and the silt fences were embedded 10 inches into the ground. Before long, I started seeing pond forming behind the silt fence barrier. But before long, I also saw that there was damaging occurring. Water was undermining this particular barrier. I also noticed the fabric material never failed. And pretty soon I noticed it going over the top. And at the end of the storm, I saw this. This is really something else that you got to be concerned with. Remember the criterion? Sediment caused by accelerated soil erosion shall be removed from runoff water before it leaves the construction site. Good luck. There's no way you can do it. Matter of fact, one of the biggest cardinal rules that you should do about silt fence barriers is never, ever put them in a drainage channel unless they're supported correctly. And that's a whole separate situation. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So when you see this type of detail, designers, ask yourself, when was the last time the best management practice detail sheets that I'm using have been updated? And have they been updated for the situation that I have, be it in an arid environment or in a tropical environment? Very important this, because when they fail, you cannot say, Mr. Contractor, you didn't do the job right. Not necessarily. It could have been the fact that the detail sheets didn't give enough leeway in there to say that these will fail when too much water or too much rainfall occurs. Some of the updates that should occur onto any type of detail sheets nowadays. First of all, make sure there's a minimum height of the detail sheet. Make sure the posts are close together. They should be no more than 6, maybe 8 feet apart, not 15. But more importantly, there's new products on the market where the bands, reinforcement bands, are put within the silt fence material that eliminates the need of wire backing. And if you look at this, you can see 2 different porosities essentially occurring for this geotextile products. And the reason for this is that when water fills up behind a silt fence barrier, you want it to go through the product and not over the product. And thus you see a bigger mesh that occurs on the upper part of this particular silt fence barrier. Then we've got on top of that the fact that you put them in, not only by trenching, but you can do it by slicing the material into the ground. There's so many new things that need to be done that to make your products and your detail sheets applicable to your site. So the fact that I want to bring out here is that silt fence barriers, you're only going to minimize the discharge of sediment-laden runoff. You're not going to prevent it. And that's a fact of life that we all got to stick with in here. But let's take the one that's starting to come up, been used in the last couple of years, fiber roll barriers. What do I mean by fiber roll barriers? Well, this looks like a snake is put on the ground with a couple sandbags to prevent it from moving any place. What's the purpose of it? Show and tell, I'm afraid, in that particular case. You might also know them as wattles, by the way. And they're good products if they're used correctly. And the key word, if they are used correctly. Because I have rarely seen any of these products fail by themselves. It's the way they've been used that's been the failure. And there's essentially 2 types. A lightweight units has maybe straw, coconut, wood chips. Some of them are sawdust. But I look at the photograph on this one here, and I look at the bottom one here, and if you can pick these up as easily as this individual's picking up that fiber roll or the wattles, it's not going to do a lot of good. Matter of fact, just look up in the top of how well it held back the sediment from going onto the concrete there. Well, you got to be careful with these things, because one of the things that occurs with these products until the material inside the roll itself gets saturated with water is that they can float. As soon as the material gets saturated with water, it hugs the ground really great. So therefore, it's doing all right, maybe. But we got to be careful here. And if it can float, think about what happens if you put them in front of an inlet. And this is a prime example of something being put in front of a storm sewer inlet that will work as long as it never rains. And the thing you got to look at is the scour right in this area here. How did that occur? It came with high velocity water coming down the street. Well, scour would have to go into here, and I've noticed this is held in place, or it looks like it's in place. What happened, basically, the water floated, came around here, and this unit floated, and all the majority of the sediment went into the inlet. This happens far more times than people like to believe. You have some deposition occurring into here, but be careful with these lightweight units. You may need to put sandbags or gravel bags on the top there to prevent them from floating. Well, now I've torn that apart. Let's take a look at the other units. These are what I call heavy units. And these particular units have enough weight that they can almost stay on the ground themselves without any stakes being put in there. And by the way, if you look at this, this is all material that came from upstream of this thing that came around this particular unit. And it did a good job holding things out there. But if you want the weight of these things, a 12-inch wattle, for example, 10-foot length of it's going to weigh about 46 pounds. So they are no longer these lightweight units that you can just carry over the top of your shoulder. There are other things that come on this thing. Are we using these for sediment control? Or are we trying to hold the soil in place? Or are we using them for erosion control? And many of these things are touted as erosion control. Ladies and gentlemen, they are not erosion control measures. I'm sorry. If there was erosion control measures, you would not have these rills that you're seeing in front of you there. But you got to put them in a trench or some type of a barrier there that holds them in place, or so that you don't have air gaps or gaps where water can flow around in there. Got to be in continuous contact with the ground. You should look for backfill material when you're putting them in. Look for stakes in the products. Those other ones, I didn't see them before. Then we have them used on hillsides. Again, are they used for sediment erosion or erosion control? These are the questions the designer had better ask. And the bottom one is the big one. Are they effective? And I've seen these throughout lots of project sites all over the nation. And the question I ask in here, are these really for sediment or erosion control, or are they for show and tell? Ladies and gentlemen, these are strictly show and tell. They have cost money. They are not doing a bit of good except when it doesn't rain. As long as it doesn't rain, they're working beautifully. So keep those in mind as we go through. And ask you about this one here. Notice the water's gone underneath it. How do you stop water from going underneath this wattle? Well, the only way I found is what they did in California. They cinched them down and put rock gravel there on the downstream side. But the wattles themselves do not do erosion control, but they can assist with erosion control by holding, in this case, straw mulch in place, or be part of hydraulic mulch. But you got to be careful with hydraulic mulch. It can fail when too much water occurs due to rainfall. Or maybe you have wood mulch in there. Or maybe you put an erosion control blanket. They all have their use. Although on this particular case down at the left one there, you probably don't need fiber rolls on top of an erosion control blanket. And so be careful what you're dealing with. So on these fiber roll blankets installed on there, remember, they do not provide erosion control. They may provide minimal sediment control. Well, let's go in here and look a little bit at our inlet protection. This is what's come out of the Modified 217 Construction General Permit. Basically, it's saying you're going to have to put something in front of inlet if any of your waters go into the waters of the United States, and all of our islands of Hawaii are surrounded by the waters of the United States. And the Pacific Ocean, while some people think it's a great set pond, is not, you're not trying to let water go in there with all that sediment occurring on there. But today the norm is to place barriers in front of all openings. And that's not all bad. It's just that what are the limitations there? For example, here we have a situation that was in Tennessee where indeed we found the barriers that were located, and notice that we found water sitting down at the bottom in the sump area. Of course, that's a miserable flooding occurrence on here. How do you stop that? The answer is you can't. You don't. And more likely, importantly, you don't want to. Because you're looking for those barriers to remove sediment from runoff water. Got two types of deals, on grade and sump inlets. And whenever you have water ponded around there, to me, that tells me this is working. We need to have flooding in order to remove sediment from runoff waters in a subdivision or even along a highway. So that's something to keep in mind. But if we're doing work that all the inlet is totally covered and it rains, it's not unreasonable to expect we're going to have a real tremendous mess in here. And you imagine what it's like if all of a sudden cars came into and found a big puddle of water they had to go through. Well, EPA in their wisdom said that we can take care of that. There's a little footnote at section 2.2.10 that says inlet measures can be removed in the event of flood conditions or prevent erosion. Who makes that decision? Contractor, if you're making it, make sure you're taking and talking to the regulatory people about it, because it could cause you problems. That is something there we've got to be real careful. And putting and seeing water come down the gutter is not a flood event. It's when it's massive amount of water coming there. Let's carry this over to area drains. One of the worst things, if you see them on your drawings, a silt fence around an area drain, don't put it in. They will fail. And try to go with something that's going to be supported by bracing or whatever the case may be. The top one is not acceptable in my mind. So keep in mind, there's so many limitations on here we got to deal with. Perhaps you can do a temporary measure, and that's all it is. Perhaps you can buy a commercial unit that are made in Georgia. And these really do a terrific job of capturing sediment toward them. But don't do the silt fence because it's going to fail. Guaranteed it there. Again, all we can do is minimize the sediment going off. Well, we took care of the first one. Should barriers be placed in front of all inlets? Daggum good question. Here we have the three inlets that you see in there with the circles coming around them. But if you notice over here at the very top and in front of that truck, there's no water standing around it. All that barrier did was to divert the water to the sump. And that happens all the time when we're dealing with this. Water goes off the site, goes downstream because the barriers do not let water go into the drain. Well, we can get some pretty massive amount of damage out in here. Who's at fault? The answer is none of us are at fault. It's the limitation that we have because we got so much runoff in here. But we should have tried to do better erosion control upstream if we could have, because there was a lot of sediment that went into that particular inlet. Remember this one down in here? Sediment will be prevented. I love that word, prevent. It's not going to always occur. So one of the facts on here is that barriers in front of on-grade inlets, they will divert runoff, not treat runoff going into the systems. So now we've done those, ask a question. Do alternatives exist to inlet barriers? Yep, but many things like this, they're not very effective. And they often fail because of cars hit them and whatever the case. So I'm asking you to think about inlet inserts. They are an excellent product to consider. But you've got to also keep in mind that after every rainfall event with sediment-laden waters going into them, they have to be cleaned out. They come in different shapes, different forms. This sometimes is called a witch's hat. This is just a sediment barrier or a bag, excuse me, on these things. Do they capture a lot of sediment? Yes, they do. Do they capture all the sediment? No, they do not. There still is a tremendous amount of sediment that leaves the site. It's the upstream that needs to be taken care of that we're forgetting about. And you cannot meet this criterion because you're always going to let sediment enter the public storm sewer system. So when we go through, we look at all these, and there again, minimize, divert. These are the things that you got to keep in mind. Designers, contractors, inspectors, and reviewers. Let's not forget about reducing the flow velocities. These are check structures that we use, and there's a lot of typical details in there that go through, and guess what? There's erosion that occurs, and you can't meet the criterion. They have their limitations. They capture sediment, but don't necessarily prevent erosion. May require numerous barriers, which if you're going to do it this way, always look at the top of the downstream barrier and see if it's in line with the upstream barrier. Then you're going to be able to take care of it. This is a scene you do not want to put on your construction sites because whenever it rains, this is what's going to happen. Don't do it. It's a norm to see them fail. See them on highway projects. They fail. You got to do it right. But they can be done if they're installed correctly. This is trenching, using the T-posts and so forth on down the line. So there's limitations that everybody's got to be aware of. And again, check structures might minimize, but they are not going to prevent. What's the most effective method? A set pond is the most effective. But a set pond needs space, or maybe it needs a little bit of a space. It needs to have a shape that's a rectangular shape, not a circular shape. And often whenever you get a circular shape that is illustrated like in this particular case, and what happens when it rains, it goes out the outlet structure, and lo and behold, downstream get impacted tremendously. Designers, remember, contractors are putting in what you designed and what the regulatory agency approved. And when you're dealing with these things, think about what's the most important parameter of all these things. And it's not the amount of water to detain, it's how much water and how fast water is leaving the site that's important. Critical things for a designer to be concerned with here. So there are different things that go through. A typical plan is often used 3,600 cubic feet of acre being captured, but in arid climates, you can get by with half that. In tropical climates, you need much more than that. So again, how you do it is so important as that you understand everything that occurs. And how you remove water out of a set pond is important. You can use rock like porous Gabions. You can use riser pipes, or you can use what the EPA recommends, skimmers. And what skimmers do, they take the water off the very top part of the pond that's been contained in the set pond. But with a riser pipe that's perforated, you're letting a lot of sediment go downstream where the skimmer does not. So again, knowing what you're dealing with, the limitations are the most important part of this whole thing. By the way, you can use some of these new silt fence materials that come in there, hold the water back. In this case, we're holding back the water. If you look at the water coming there, it still has some sediment in there, but not like what it was coming down toward it. But that's the result of two different porous types of materials. So using the new materials, you're still going to be using discharging of sediment leaving the site, but you're doing it in vast improvement. I got to talk a little bit about erosion control. We have hydraulic mulches in there where people try to put them and shoot the spray of the seed and the mulch on the hillside, and they work great as long as you use the right application and at the right time of year. But you got to be careful. There's possible problems with using hydraulic mulches. One of them is shadowing, where if you shoot it from one direction, you're going to have areas that are not covered. Then there's dry mulches that can be used. And the only big one on here is that you got to make sure you got long enough fiber length on there. But you don't grow a lot of straw in Hawaii like they do here in Kansas. So coverage is very important on here. So if we have at least 80% coverage, that's a good one. There's our fair one, and there's a poor one out there in the distance. All these are limitations to be concerned with, as limitations exist with erosion control blankets. They're used on the hillsides. They provide a good source of erosion protection, and they should be used whenever you can implement them. They have limitations. When it rains, water goes underneath the blanket. And if you happen to have a fiber roll on top, that is fine when you have excess water coming in there, but it's probably not doing that much good overall to stop erosion. We usually do not need fiber rolls on top of blanks. Doesn't hurt it, but you don't always need it if you've done the right job for the blanket that's on the hillside itself. So keep all those things in mind. And same thing holds true in drainage channels. You may not need the fiber roll in there. They're excessive costs. They're good products. There's nothing wrong with them, but they may not be necessary as long as the designer does the job the way he or she is supposed to do. With that in mind, got to keep there that these things assist with vegetation, but don't prevent it. And we are able to minimize erosion, but we can't stop it. So this means that all parties are going to have to communicate. This means reviewers, designers, contractors, inspectors. You got to talk. And these two people right here have got to talk the most. And by the way, all of you should have something that's very similar to the qualifications in here. A reviewer is not just checking a checklist. It's can you look at there and see it's good engineering being done, or agronomy for vegetation, and how much common sense do you have? All those are necessary. By the way, there's not one profession that says that they're an expert in sediment erosion control. It's a multidisciplinary endeavor on here. So designers, reviewers, do these things that we're indicating. You've got to have practical plans. You've got to work continuously together. And if you're a reviewer, you've got three things, or inspector, excuse me, you got three things you need to deal with. These are identified in the construction general permit. You got to maintain all these things, because if you don't communicate, you're not going to make this whole thing go away. And it's never going to go away, but we can minimize it as much as we possibly can. So in summary, very quickly here, we cannot prevent the erosion. We cannot prevent sediment discharges. We can minimize it dramatically. And that's what we got to strive to do. Make sure those detail sheets that you're using address your local climatic conditions. Understand the limitations of sediment and erosion control BMPs. They all have limitations. Always communicate, because when you communicate, then you're going to solve the problems. Well, that's a summary of what I've learned over about 30 years of experience in this business. And all I can tell you is the more I go out to construction sites, the more I realize how little I know. Hopefully this provided a little bit of information to you that you can start thinking, seeing to yourself, hey, what is it we can do better? Thank you very much for your time. Alicia, yep.
Thank you, Jerry, for your presentation. We're now going to open up the question and answer portion of the session. So if anyone has any questions for Jerry, please type them in the Q&A section at this time.
Gee whiz, nobody had a question of what I was saying. I'll be happy to answer them. And by the way, if you have any questions in the future, there's our telephone number. Please give us a call. I realize I left off my email address, which is hdi@eastcentral.com. You can send it there. It's at our booth too.
We'll give them a couple minutes to put in some questions. Maybe some brains are storming right now. Some
I think I
topics.
gave them a lot of material there.
Yeah. Okay, we got our first question from an anonymous attendee. What is the spacing for the pins on the wattle?
The pins on the wattles or the stakes on the wattles, I've seen them vary all over the place. The heavy ones, manufacturers say you don't need any in there, but I don't agree with that one. You could probably put on the heavier wattles one every maybe 10 feet apart because they're going to hold in place. But the lightweight ones, you better keep them no more than 3 or 4 feet apart. That's the only way they're going to work. When it rains, that is, excuse me.
Very good.
That was neat. There we go. There's another one.
Another question. What are the opinions on cutoff swales at the top of slopes?
Very good question. The cutoff swales on top of slopes, to me, are needed if you're trying to minimize that off-site flows coming onto your property. The biggest problem that I've encountered with them on construction sites is where does that water discharge and how is it controlled where you discharge the water off-site? And you may have to end up doing some stabilization at the discharge end, especially if there's a long, steep slope that's the water's going down, or if you put it in a slope drain. So not only are the swales a good idea for off-site flows, but always keep in mind how is that water discharging that you've captured, and where does it go after you discharge it off the slope itself. Like another one's coming in.
Neil says, great presentation. Appreciate your time and information.
Thank you, Neil. I appreciate your comments.
And we have another question. Anonymous, should inlet protection devices be pulled during a large rain event?
Got to define to me what a large rainfall event. In Colorado, a large rainfall event would be 2 inches of rainfall. That may be a common rainfall event on the east side of Oahu. I don't know. That's one that you're going to have to confer with or work with, especially somebody who's going to make a decision, and they're probably going to be a regulatory person to a certain extent. And also, do you have inserts in there? Are the inserts in there going to be taking care of the runoff waters that are going to be flooding down at that area? So it's a very politically charged question to answer. And I'm not answering it directly for you because I don't want to make those decisions as to who's going to pull that away, because if it destroys some property downstream, I don't want to be liable for that situation at all. Very good question, though.
And another question, is there slope restriction for the erosion control matting you mentioned? Will erosion matting work on a 1-to-1 slope?
Oh boy. Erosion control matting, you're probably going to have to go with the turf reinforcement mat on that real steep slopes that you're indicating there. As far as flow restrictions and everything else, the flow restrictions in my mind come with, is there water cascading on top of the blanket material from upstream? That's where the wattles do come in and are useful. But if they're not, then you got to have to say, okay, do we have a robust, like a turf reinforcement mat that's going in there, well staked in and everything that's gone down the hillside? By the way, I forgot to mention, be sure you put seed on the ground first before you put the blanket on there. I've seen where it's just been the opposite direction. And they were wondering why no vegetation got established. Good questions.
Yeah, I have a few more questions.
That's fine. I'm here all day.
Jason wants to know, what frequency storm in Colorado is a 2-inch event representative of?
It says question one more time. You faded away a little bit on me there.
What frequency storm in Colorado is a 2-inch event representative of?
I've got to remember my deals here. Let me start backwards. A 100-year storm event is 4.1 inches of rainfall in Denver, Colorado. So a 2-inch rainfall event is probably going to be a 10-year, maybe a little bit higher, 20 or 25-year event. So just the way we have, we're in a different climate than you are in Hawaii.
Next question is, what kind of erosion control can be used for rock fall mitigation?
Rock, I heard the rock, I didn't hear what the last word was.
Rock fall mitigation.
Rock fall,
Yeah.
F-A-L-L?
Yep.
That I'm afraid I couldn't answer because I don't have any expertise in that at all. So that would have to be more somebody with structural.
Someone would like a clarity on what sedimentation is?
Sedimentation is the process by which the suspended particles are deposited or fall out of runoff waters. For example, you saw those slides with a sed pond. A sed pond just simply slows the velocity of water down so you can get deposition of the sediments that are suspended in runoff. Same thing holds true when I said that you want to have flooding in front of your inlets. Those barriers are slowing the water down so deposition can occur. So sedimentation itself is a method by which the deposition occurs. It is different from filtration, by the way, where filtration of the product actually removes the particles out of the water by trapping them within the fabric material. But the predominant method is by ponding of water for removal of sediment particles out of runoff waters. And they cause flooding. And if you don't have flooding, that means it's not working. Isn't that an oxymoron relationship there for contractors?
Okay. Last one we have in here is from Janelle. Just wanted to say I also enjoyed your presentation. Very informative and easy to follow. Mahalo nui.
Thank you very much for that nice compliment, Janelle. And I've done it once or twice, and I love being able to present things under here. And hopefully, I've had you and all the other participants start thinking a little bit about what is necessary to try to protect the environment, because it's pretty important for us to do it for our kids' sakes. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. There's no other open questions at this time. So thank you, Jerry, for your presentation. That now concludes this session. Thank you all for attending. The next sessions begin at 2 p.m. So please return to the sessions tab to see the next breakout sessions. And don't forget to stop by the networking lounge to talk with other attendees and check the leaderboard to see if you're in the lead. There's still a lot of time to earn points. So thank you.
Bye-bye.